Thank you so much, Linda. I'm going to set my timer, my internal timer, for this amazing invitation. It's a return invitation for me. I was at the third Markesbery Symposium now. This is lucky 13 for me. And so I'm very grateful to be here. That video, wow. It's not fair that I have to be the first one right up after the video. But I, as an outsider, I do believe that Sanders Brown is leading the charge. So keep up the great work. I will start out today by telling you a few disclosures that I'm required to tell you about with regards to my advisory boards or consulting for various foundations, pharma, biotech, because it really takes a village to get these new therapies into the clinic. And so as academics, we play important roles in doing that. The questions I'm going to address today for you are shown here. We want to talk about what causes brain inflammation. We're going to talk about what are the types of cells in the brain and proteins or genes or hormones that might contribute to this inflammation. We'll talk about the evidence of inflammation in Alzheimer's and other dementias. And then we'll talk about how does a good gut health program or regimen benefit you in general and your brain. And then finally, what is the best way to keep inflammation in check? So this schematic seems complicated, but it really just sends one major message, and that is that your brain communicates with all external organs. So we used to be told that the brain was completely isolated from the rest of the body, immune privileged, if you will, but that's not really the case. And so the brain communicates through various substances in the blood, in your cerebrospinal fluid, with other organs, with the gut, with the liver, with parts of your body that impact your brain function, especially as we age. And there are substances that are made that keep the communication open and healthy. But as we age, some of this balance goes awry, and this communication breaks down, if you will. The signals that your brain or your organs are sending back to the brain become a little garbled, and the conversation between the brain and other organs tends to deteriorate. And so keep in mind that, we probably were not meant to live this long. We have strong evolutionary pressure to develop immune responses to keep you healthy so that you can pass on your genes. But once you pass on your genes, that's it. And so what has happened is that as we live longer, our bodies, our tissues become a little tired, a little exhausted. That's actually a term called immune exhaustion. And this is due to repeated infections, repeated exposures to your environment, things like, COVID and the flu and things that your body needs to keep you healthy around. So when you start aging, this conversation starts to go downhill, and some of the signals may be missing, or they may be misinterpreted by the brain or by the tissues. And one important thing to remember is that what's in the brain is obviously your neurons, your circuits, the pathways that regulate your memory and your behavior. But there are also cells coming in from the outside of your brain into your brain across what we call the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is not really a physical barrier. It's more of a biochemical barrier where things go in and out in a very regulated fashion. Well, this barrier also breaks down as you're aging. And things that are circulating in your bloodstream and things that you've been exposed to through your diet are likely to leak across, and some of them might be toxic to your brain. So the cells that live in the brain that are responsible for keeping the house clean, if you will, the professional vacuum cleaners, the professional phagocytes, as we call them, because they engulf pathogens and they engulf debris and engulf, aggregated proteins and other waste. They're called the microglia. And these microglia are little dainty cells that survey the environment. They really, truly vacuum up the house. And they are also in communication with other cell types that keep the blood-brain barrier working just right. But as you age, the neurons that the microglia are taking care of and the microglia are both aging. So it's kind of like parents taking care of children, and then the parents start to age and get tired, and there's challenges to that. So what happens across the ages and with different exposures or toxins or things in your environment, these microglia undergo these pathological changes. Instead of being dainty and have lots of little arms, they become more amoeboid, more activated. And they start producing things that may not be in the best interest of your neurons. One of my postdocs likes to use the analogy that, you have parents taking care of children and the parents run into trouble. You need to rehabilitate the parents and reboot them, rejuvenate them somehow to give them more energy. Maybe, getting some energy from the energy that the kids have, that my husband likes to say, they suck it right out of you. So these changes occur as you're aging. And we believe that they occur even more so in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So you'll hear more about tau and amyloid from Dr. Morgan. And I just want to tell you that while we all acknowledge that the Alzheimer's brain has lost neurons and volume and has these accumulated plaques of amyloid, there are a lot of things that also glum up in that amyloid. It's kind of like sticky mess where you start sinking in all sorts of things that can't come out and can't do their normal function to keep your neurons healthy. And we know that inflammation is normally a good thing when it's a fast, short-lived event. So a normal inflammatory response, say when you cut your finger or stub your toe, you have a fast response that heals the tissue, and then all the immune cells that cause the edema and produce substances to heal you go back in their cages. What happens is if you have a sustained inflammatory response, like it never goes away, that is not a good thing because of the substances that these cells are producing. And this tends to bombard your tissues and your neurons, your brain, with a lot of substances that cause these neurons to want to die. There's a lot of oxidative stress that goes on. So inflammatory events during aging, things like, aging itself, head injuries, which are a risk factor for Parkinson's, for instance. And we believe other conditions that are consisting of chronic inflammation in your body act to accelerate that aging process and very likely to accelerate the neurodegenerative process. So the diagram on the far right is to basically say that there's complex two-way relationships between these tangles in the amyloid and the inflammation that you have in your brain as well as outside your brain. And what we think is happening is that when you get these protein aggregates, like amyloid beta or synuclein for Parkinson's or Huntington's and Huntington's disease, that this acts as a constant activation trigger for these microglial cells. And so they become really inflamed and they never shut down. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount of inflammation. It's a low level inflammation, but it's sustained. And we believe that this is what gives rise to the cell death of your neurons. Now, how could you accelerate this cascade? How could you put your foot on the gas pedal? Well, we believe that these chronic inflammatory conditions or environmental exposures, pesticides, maybe physical inactivity or unhealthy diet, are those triggers from your environment that are not genetic, right? You have control over them for the most part. Those are things that accelerate this entire process. So, is there evidence for inflammation in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias? There's plenty of evidence when you look post-mortem at an autopsy brain. But the problem is you don't know when it started, right? And we now think through the MRI and PET imaging that it is very likely to start early in the disease and it's just maintained. Now, we also know from looking at your plasma or your CSF or your stool that you tend to show signs of inflammation as you get older, and people with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's have much more inflammation in these fluids. We think that that's an opportunity to use the immune system as a sentinel to give us clues about who might be walking down an accelerated path and who might be a good candidate for an immunomodulatory or anti-inflammatory intervention. We also know from a whole bunch of epidemiological studies, these are studies where you find people with Alzheimer's, people without Alzheimer's, and you look for associations between things they did or took or didn't do or didn't take, and you say, people that have taken a lot of ibuprofen for many, many years as a group have a reduced incidence of XYZ, okay? And it turns out that from millions of medical records, there's suggestive evidence that if you consumed large amounts of anti-inflammatories in midlife for things like sports injuries, tennis elbow, or some of the autoimmune conditions that we have in our society, that as a group, those millions of people that were on these anti-inflammatories have less incidence of dementia. Now, I don't want to imply causality, and I don't want you to run out and start taking ibuprofen, because that would be bad for your gut. But I think the message is that inflammation in midlife, when it's sustained, is not a good thing and is definitely not a friend to your brain. You'll also hear from Dr. Morgan that there are genetics that support the idea that immune dysregulation or immune dysfunction may be part of the picture that contributes to Alzheimer's and dementias. You can't change your genetics yet, but you can change the environmental piece that has interplay with those genetics. So Dr. Van Eldik mentioned the anti-inflammatories that I was involved in co-inventing, and they're called tumor necrosis factor, or TNF. You might have heard of it. A lot of people with rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's overproduce it, right? And there are blockbuster drugs to bring down the amount of TNF in your body and control your inflammation. They've been FDA approved for about 20 years. This TNF is made by a lot of cells. Your microglia make it, your astrocytes make it, and even the neurons, when they're injured, they also secrete it. So what is the evidence that TNF has anything to do with Alzheimer's? Well, we know that it seems to be elevated in the plasma of people with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. That was very early on by Dr. Phillett. Then we also know that cerebrospinal fluid in many patients, not all, tends to have high levels of TNF. When you look at autopsy brains, the TNF seems to be high around the plaques. And finally, we see that TNF levels tend to correlate with disease progression, tau, amyloid. Again, not in everybody. So what happens if you take TNF out of the equation? What happens if you ask the question, what is the risk of Alzheimer's disease of an individual that has rheumatoid arthritis relative to the general population? Turns out that based on millions of medical records, it's an 8-fold risk. But if you are on an anti-TNF drug, that risk falls through the floor. So there are many, many other studies suggesting, again, that lowering inflammation, lowering TNF may buy you something that reduces your risk for Alzheimer's and other dementias. Now, the problem with these drugs is that they block both the soluble form of TNF that causes your inflammation, but they also block a really important part of TNF that's attached to the membrane. And that is important for fighting infection. And it turns out that people on these drugs end up having opportunistic infections. They have higher risk for TB. So it's not the ideal drug to use to take into the Alzheimer's market. In fact, Pfizer decided not to do that with their antibody infliximab. And they were in the news several years ago because people are like, how could you not have done that? Well, first of all, these drugs don't get into the brain very well. But second, I think you don't want to immunosuppress individuals. So this triad that I'm going to talk about next now involves your brain, your blood, and your gut. Why your gut? Well, there are also immune cells in your gut. There are both innate immune cells, cousins to the microglia, called macrophages. There are adaptive immune cells, B cells and T cells. Your B cells make antibodies. Your T cells are the ones that are selectively recognizing some of those pathogens that come in because the macrophages chew them up and then they decorate their outside with them and they go up to a T cell and they go, here you go get it, right? So that is what we call adaptive immunity. So what happens is there are T cells and there are macrophages in your gut that are making things that are talking to your brain. We didn't know about this until a few years ago. So this is why gut health is important. And the lumen of the gut is obviously a barrier against the exterior, just like your skin is, just like your epithelial lining in your lungs. And so in a normal condition, you have a very tight gut barrier and you have bacteria in the lumen, which is normal. They're called commensals and you need them to absorb nutrients, but sometimes they become a little out of balance. And certainly when you take antibiotics, you wipe them out and then you bounce back as you eat more food and get recolonized. Turns out that that barrier is critical for keeping all those metabolites made by the bacteria away from your immune cells down below. But if that barrier starts to leak, then bacterial products go down and they activate all the immune cells and you get this gut inflammation going. So how does this happen? Well, we think it happens with aging, but it probably happens with bad diets. It probably happens certainly with inflammatory bowel disease, right? Because that's a condition that you have remodeling of inflammatory processes and remodeling of the muscular layer, and it's an ongoing process. So what is the bacteria in your gut doing? So you've heard a lot about the gut microbiome, but it turns out we have microbiomes everywhere, in your skin, in your mouth, in your lungs, in your nasal epithelium. But the gut microbiome has received the most attention. We can take the bacteria in your gut, and because they have DNA, we can sequence it and we can figure out what's there. And when you do that, you figure out if you have good balance or if you have dysbiosis, which means, the good bacteria are kind of out of kilter with the bad bacteria. And your microbiome in the gut, you acquire it at birth as a fetus, which is sterile, goes through the vaginal canal. And so it's interesting when you look at the fetal microbiome in the gut, it looks a lot like the maternal vaginal microbiome. But then as the fetus starts, baby starts eating, they develop their own gut microbiome based on what you're feeding them. And this bacteria is really important. It changes throughout your life. It's affected by diet, genetics, your environment. But it's important because it is needed for digesting your food, for absorbing nutrients, and it regulates, it talks to the immune cells underlying your gut lining, as well as the brain, through things that they produce that circulate. Now, we know that antibiotics can destroy this bacteria, and it can be life-saving, right? You need to have sometimes antibiotics for infection. But what happens is they wipe out the bacteria. Some of them are more sensitive than others, and then they leave an empty space for the bad bacteria to take over. And that's when you get dysbiosis. Now, Some of you may have heard of Clostridium difficile, which is a life-threatening infection that you get, and they have to treat you for it, but it tends to be very antibiotic resistant. And one of the ways that sometimes they manage it is by giving you a fecal microbiota transplant from someone. It sounds fancy, but it isn't. They put you under anesthesia, they flush you out, they flush you in with somebody else's fecal matter, wait a little bit, and off you go. So it's life-saving. Now, in an ideal situation, we don't want to do that. We just want to figure out what is good about the bacteria and put that in a bottle. The gut microbiome has been implicated in a whole bunch of conditions, including Alzheimer's disease, but it's still very early for us to really understand if we can use your gut microbiome to identify risk or to predict progression, right? But it's early days. We're working on it. Then there's links between obesity and Alzheimer's disease that we all recognize, right? And type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. We think the reason this is because obesity is a condition where you have a lot of inflammation in your tissues, okay? And you end up having, in addition to aging, as you're getting older, right? You get more and more oxidative stress produced by this increased inflammation, and you get potentially activation of these microglia that I told you about. So this is the hypothalamus in a person with a BMI less than 25 compared to a BMI of over 30. And what you can see, hopefully, is that you have many more rounded up and browner, darker cells when you have higher BMI. So again, these are the cells that are supposed to be cleaning up the house. And instead of cleaning, they're just secreting cytokines and becoming more inflamed. Some people like to say they can't chew and walk and chew gum at the same time. That may be true. And so this is the model where we think that obesity and high-fat diets may contribute to a leaky gut by eroding the lining. You end up having a metabolic syndrome, diabetic, dyslipidemia, right? Your triglycerides are also out of whack. And that contributes to circulating levels of inflammatory molecules, which then erode your blood-brain barrier. So now you've got two leaky situations, and this inflammation contributes to dysregulating those cells that are supposed to be cleaning the house. So that's why we think that this contributes to even more plaque and tangle formation. And you hear more about that from Dr. Morgan. So if you look back at TNF, I said, it's possible that this is mediating some of these changes. And so we took a mouse that has a predisposition to develop amyloid pathology, the 5X mouse, here, collaboration with Chris Norris and Donna Wilcock. And we fed this mouse a high-fat, high-fructose diet. But halfway through that, we inhibited the soluble TNF with this new drug that we've been developing, which Linda mentioned is now in clinical trials, phase 2 for Alzheimer's and MCI. So if we give this mouse that's eating a bad diet, an anti-TNF inhibitor, which you can give subcutaneously and enters the brain, then you can prevent the acceleration of amyloid pathology that you get with obesity or a bad diet. Now that amyloid pathology isn't huge. So obesity is not necessarily acting through increasing your amyloid load, but it's definitely triggering a lot more brain inflammation. We know that the obesogenic diet induces a leaky gut, and the soluble TNF blocks that, soluble TNF inhibition. And we know that the bad diet increases traffic of immune cells from your blood into your brain, which we don't think is a great thing. And finally, we saw that the bad diet makes your gut microbiome more inflamed, so more bad bacteria, and the soluble TNF inhibition partially, not entirely, but partially reverses that. So we think that this is a good reason to take this into clinical trials. And the Alzheimer's Association funded Immune Bio, which is a biotech company that licensed this soluble TNF inhibitor. Again, it only inhibits the soluble form, right? So it doesn't immunosuppress you. It was a small trial where they're looking at people with MCI or Alzheimer's and inflammation. You had to have high CRP, you had to have high sedimentation rate, or high hemoglobin A1C, or be an ApoE4 carrier. 2 out of 4, and you were in the trial. So they're just looking to see, can this drug lower the brain inflammation? And so they saw in the CSF on the far left that about 20 some markers of inflammation were down in the high dose. So this is open label. Everybody knows what they're taking, right? So there's a placebo effect always. In the middle, you see an MRI measure indirectly measuring inflammation. And that seemed to go down in the blue line compared to a cohort that wasn't treated from an ADNI database. And finally, the correlation between sticking you in the, putting you with a lumbar tap to get the CSF inflammation versus the MRI, the correlation is so good, they decided, forget the CSF for the phase 2, we're just doing MRI. We will know about inflammation that way. This drug at the high dose also improved the fiber density in the pathways in the brain that are relevant for Alzheimer's by about 17%. And it also improved the myelin sheath around those tracks after 12 months of therapy by about 16%. So it's having an effect on inflammation. That is a good thing. And we know also from proteomics and looking at what is in the CSF that the levels of phospho-tau and the levels of neurofilament light chain, which are 2 markers that clinicians look for to see drug effects, those are both down by about 40%. And the markers of synaptic function and how well your neurons are passing on signals to other neurons has improved. So the take-home points from this talk is that the brain communicates with your external organs, that gut health is important for brain health, that lifestyle choices, diet, exercise are very, very likely to impact both your gut and your brain permeability, and they influence brain inflammation over time. And we believe that based on the animal studies and based on the epidemiology, this chronic inflammation is also very likely to contribute to your increased risk for an age-related neurodegenerative disease. So if that's true, and this XPro 1595 has been used in like 70 or 80 labs across the world in different animal models, and it all says that soluble TNF in excess chronically is not your friend. And so we're going to try to target that to reduce the risk for people at risk for Alzheimer's, either because of family history or because they're chronically inflamed. And we hope that anti-soluble TNF interventions that don't immunosuppress you may prove to be some additional tool in the arsenal to delay or prevent Alzheimer's disease along with immunotherapy. And to thank the team that makes the magic happen. We moved, as Linda mentioned, from Emory in 2019 to the University of Florida. It's been a wonderful environment, and we made it through COVID. As many of you know, the state of Florida didn't really shut down, and so we were fortunate enough to keep going and build a team, since we firmly believe that it takes a village to combat these diseases, and we think of science as a team sport. So I encourage you all to participate in this team sport by enrolling in clinical trials here at Sanders Brown or wherever your home may be. Thank you.